Howdy, folks. Today, I'm going to tell you all a story that's mighty close to my heart. It's about how far a mama will go when her child is in danger. It all happens out in the rugged American West, a place where the big, open sky can hide the fact that your chances of making it are mighty slim. This is a place where the past can sneak up on you, and love can be just as risky as a bullet. It all starts on a quiet, lonely ranch. Just a normal day that turns into something that'll force a woman to decide if she's going to keep hiding or make her stand. Now, before we get this show on the road, do me a favor and hit that like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The sun was bleeding all over the horizon above Rattlesnake Gulch, making the shadows long and twisted on the scorched earth as five riders appeared on the ridge. Their dark shapes stood out sharp against that dying light. They pulled up their horses, let the dust settle, and set their eyes on the single ranch down below, where the warm glow from the cabin windows looked like a peaceful welcome. "That's the one," the man in the lead grumbled, his voice as rough as a rock. "Widow Knox's place." Now, what those fellas up on the ridge didn't know was that the woman working that little piece of land was once the most feared gun in the Western Territories. They called her Quick Draw, a living legend whose hands were quicker than a blink. She was the same woman who, back in '72, put down 10 members of the Blackwell Raiders in 10 heartbeats during that famous Prescott bank robbery. The rider out front, a man most folks just called Rook Mercer, lifted a brass spyglass to his eye. He studied the little homestead real slow and careful. His scarred face didn't show a thing, but a mean little sparkle danced in his pale gray eyes. "Stick around, 'cause tomorrow's got a twist you won't want to miss." The ranch itself didn't look like much. Just a small, whitewashed cabin, a sturdy barn that was kept up nice, a corral with a few good-looking horses, and a fenced-in pasture where some cattle were wandering in the evening heat. Nothing about it screamed money, just a lot of hard work and honest living. "You sure this is it?" asked the youngest rider, his voice a little shaky as he shifted in his saddle. "Looks like it's just a widow and her girl. Don't seem like it's worth the trouble," he mumbled. Rook Mercer kept that spyglass right where it was. "That ground sits on the only spring for 10 miles, he said, letting it sink in. "The railroad survey folks confirmed it last month. When the drought hits, whoever holds that water is going to own this entire valley." He snapped the spyglass shut. "And Hollis Granger wants every last drop of it." Just saying Granger's name put an end to the talk. He was the land baron who ran everything west of Shadow Creek. When Granger set his sights on something, you either sold it to him or you disappeared. These five men were hired for that exact reason. They didn't have a conscience between them. "Now remember," Rook said, sliding the spyglass into his saddlebag, "Granger wants this done quiet. We make her an offer," he said. "If she says no, then we start persuading her." A nasty little grin spread across his face. "And if we got to use the girl to persuade her, well, that's just business." While those men were making their plans, down in the cabin, Belle Knox was kneading dough with her hands, steady as a clock. She was 41 now, with streaks of silver in her dark hair, which was braided down her back real tight. She had her sleeves rolled up high, showing off forearms made strong by years of hard work. That was a strength she earned not from gunfights, but from 6 long seasons of working the land by herself after her husband, Ian Knox, passed away. Through the open window, Belle watched her daughter, Rowan Knox, collecting eggs from the chicken coop. At 16, Rowan had her mother's same sharp green eyes and quiet grit. She hadn't been touched by the darkness that used to follow Belle. She moved with a light step, humming a little tune as she filled up her basket. "Ma," Rowan called out, holding up a big brown egg. "Old Bessie really went and did it today. This thing is huge." A smile softened the hard lines on Belle's face. "That old hen is always full of surprises," she called back. "Just like you are, honey." For 6 years, they had made their home on this sun-baked piece of Arizona territory, far away from all the whispers and old stories. Out here, Belle was just a widow woman. Folks respected her for raising the best quarter horses in the county and for teaching the little ones on Sundays. She kept to herself mostly, but she'd never turn her back on a neighbor who needed help. Nobody in Rattlesnake Gulch had any idea that those hands of hers were once famous all the way from Dodge City to Tombstone. Nobody knew that Belle Knox had outdrawn every single man who was dumb enough to challenge her when she was guarding Wells Fargo shipments. And nobody knew she earned her name the day she put 10 bullets into 10 outlaws. Every shot was perfect, and every shot was the last thing they ever felt. She dusted the flour off her hands and walked over to a carved oak chest in the corner. She only ever opened it when Rowan was outside, and only when the memories got too heavy to carry. Inside were old newspaper clippings all yellowed with time. Quick draw, bell stops, stagecoach robbery. Female gunslinger bow outshoots every challenger. 10 men, 10 seconds, 10 bullets. Underneath those papers was a matched pair of custom Colt peacemakers. They had ivory grips with turquoise set in them, and the barrels had fancy scrollwork that hid how deadly they were. They were works of art, made by Orrin Black, perfectly balanced with triggers so light they felt like they could read your mind. It had been 6 years since she last wore them. 6 years since Ian was killed by a stray bullet during that Prescott robbery, leaving Belle with a 10-year-old girl and only one choice to make. She could stay a legend, or she could give her daughter a normal life. She chose peace. She swapped her gun leather for flour sacks, her holsters for an apron, and a gunslinger's stance for a mother's hug. But she kept the Colts. She could never bring herself to get rid of Black's fine work. The woman who used them, though, was locked away deep inside. Then she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Belle went completely still, her gut telling her something was wrong before her mind caught up. Riders were coming, tall, and they were coming fast, Mom. Belle Knox slid the Colts back into their secret spot and walked to the window just as the men rode into view. There were 5 of them, and they were moving with a purpose, not like friendly neighbors dropping by for a chat. Her face hardened, and old feelings she had buried long ago started to stir. Her hand moved all by itself, reaching for a gun that was no longer on her hip. It was a habit burned deep into her muscles, older than any thought. Rowan, she called out, her voice calm, but with a sharp edge to it that her daughter knew meant business. Get inside, now. Rowan looked up right away. She heard that change in her mother's voice and didn't ask any questions. She dropped the egg basket right where it was and ran for the cabin. At 16 years old, she knew that when her ma used that tone, it was serious. It's important, Belle added, her voice low. As Rowan ran through the door, Belle saw the riders slow down. Their eyes stayed on her daughter for just a second too long. Belle's back went straight as a board. Her mind started clicking through details with a cold, clear focus. The cocky look on the man out front, the nervous energy of the youngest one, the quiet way the tall rider sat there, sizing everything up. Who are they, Ma? Rowan asked as she shut the door behind her. I don't know, Belle answered, her eyes still locked on the men. But I need you to go to the root cellar, out the back door, and you stay there until I tell you to come out. Rowan started to argue, but now, Belle said, and that one word put an end to any argument. Rowan did as she was told. As the sound of her footsteps faded away, Belle went to the fireplace and took down Ian Knox's old Winchester rifle. It wasn't as fast or balanced as her Colt's, but it would have to do. The riders stopped right in front of the cabin, the dust swirling around their horses' legs. The leader, a man with a hard face and a scar that cut right through his left eyebrow, tipped his hat like he was a perfect gentleman. But it was all for show. Mrs. Knox, he said, his voice smooth like oil, but with a threat hidden underneath. Belle stepped out onto the porch, holding the Winchester loosely by her side. She looked just like any other ranch woman meeting strangers. But anyone who knew her from before would have seen the little changes, the way her feet were planted, that quiet stillness that meant she was ready for anything. Gentlemen, she said in a calm voice, if y'all are enjoying this story so far, think about subscribing. It helps us out more than you know. Now, back to our tale. Her voice stayed pleasant, not giving away any of the quick thinking going on in her head. She was calculating the distance, the angles, where the sun was, and how the wind was blowing. Can I help you? I surely hope so, ma'am, the leader said back. My name's Rook Mercer. These men here ride with me. We've come on behalf of Mr. Hollis Granger from over at Shadow Creek. He paused, waiting for his name to sink in. Belle's face didn't change one bit. And what is it I can do for Mr. Hollis Granger? Mercer leaned forward in his saddle just a little. Mr. Granger wants to buy your land. He's willing to pay you double what it's worth. I'm afraid my land's not for sale, Belle answered, her voice steady. Not now, not ever. There's plenty of open country around Rattlesnake Gulch, she added, if Mr. Granger is looking to expand. A cold look passed through Mercer's eyes. That's a shame. We had our hearts set on this particular piece. It's got good water. It's in a strong position. It's strategic. The way he said that last word told her everything she needed to know. These men were not here to make a deal. With the railroad coming west, water was power, and her spring, which ran even in the driest times, could control this whole valley. Like I said, Belle replied, her voice firm now, it is not for sale. Now I've got bread in the oven and chores to do. Good day to you. She started to turn back toward the door, but she was watching their reflections in the window glass. That's a mighty fine-looking daughter you have there, model, Mercer called after her, a new hardness in his voice. This is a dangerous world for a young lady. Belle's hand stopped on the doorframe. For 6 long years, she had pushed the past down deep, keeping her fast draw a buried secret, but some threats demand more than silence. She turned around slow and met Mercer's stare straight on. Something in her expression flickered, just for a moment. The smug look on his face started to fade. My answer is the same, Mr. Mercer, she said, her voice still polite but now lined with iron. I suggest you and your men find another road to travel. She went on. Rattlesnake Gulch is a quiet town. We aim to keep it that way. Mercer watched her, feeling a current running under her calm surface. He gave one sharp, deliberate nod. We will be back, he promised. Belle did not even blink as they turned to leave. After a second, Rook Mercer gave a stiff nod and wheeled his horse around. Our paths will cross again, he called over his shoulder. Mrs. Knox. Then he added, almost like an afterthought, folks around here might get real curious to find out just who their neighbor is. The words hung in the air long after the riders were gone. They proved what Belle already suspected. Mercer knew a piece of her past, or at least he thought he did. She stood there until the dust settled on the empty ridge before she called out, Rowan, you can come on up now. Her mind was already racing miles ahead. Tonight she would have to open the false bottom of the trunk in her room, the one Rowan had never seen. Down inside rested the last pieces of quick draw Belle. There was a hand-tooled gun belt with custom holsters, a pair of soft leather gloves worn slick from thousands of practice draws, and the most important thing of all, her shooting journal. It held every duel, every show, and every single technique she had perfected and then put away for 6 quiet years. It looked like the legend was not going to stay buried after all. Rattlesnake Gulch was barely a dot on most maps. It was a forgotten spot in the Arizona Badlands, where life moved with the steady beat of the seasons instead of ambition. Main Street had only the essentials. There was Moore's General Store, the Dusty Boot Saloon, a church painted white, and Sheriff Cyrus Holt's office. Past the town, a few ranches spread out under rust-colored mesas that stood like old giants waiting for trouble to arrive. Belle Knox's ranch was 3 miles to the east, near enough for supplies but far enough for peace. The cabin that Amon Knox had built with his own 2 hands sat among well-kept pastures. A young apple orchard was just starting to show its blossoms, and a clear spring flowed nearby that had never run dry, not even in the worst of the droughts. The next afternoon, those same unwelcome men found Belle in town while she was finishing her regular Saturday deliveries. Her quarter-horse foals were known all over the territory, wanted for their endurance and their good sense. That new bay colt might be your finest yet, Elizabeth Moore said, as she took the list for Belle's weekly supplies. She and her husband had been running the store since Rattlesnake Gulch was nothing more than a watering hole and a hope. How was Rowan? Ellsworth asked. We missed seeing her at the social last Sunday. Just a little touch of spring fever, Belle answered, picking out coffee beans with focus. She is over at the Willows place helping with their new foal. The bell over the door jingled when the Sheriff Cyrus Holt came inside. Now in his 50s, Holt was as much a part of the town as the Masons themselves. He was steady, watchful, and never one to move without a good reason. His badge gleamed in the light as he gave a nod. Mrs. Knox, Mrs. Moore. Belle nodded back, seeing the stiffness in his shoulders. The visit from Mercer's riders was clearly on his mind. You had some company yesterday, did you not? Holt asked. News sure gets around fast, Belle said in an even tone, folding the coffee into a paper bag. Tate Willows saw them riding away from your ranch, Holt explained. He said they did not look like friendly visitors. She picked her words with care. Holt was a fine lawman, but even a fine lawman could mistake being careful for being weak. Just a few men looking to purchase some land, she said in a light voice. I told them no. Ellsworth leaned forward. Those are the same men who were asking questions in the saloon. Silas said they were rough-looking types, drinking for 3 nights straight, asking about property lines. Holt nodded. That is them. The group is led by a man named Rook Mercer. He looked at Belle's face very closely. I never heard that name before yesterday, she answered, and it was the truth, though a faint memory stirred deep in her mind. I sent wires to Tucson and Prescott, Holt said. Mercer and his boys do not always buy their land through legal means. Granger's men, Ellsworth added in a low voice. Everybody knows that Hollis Granger does not like being told no. Holt's eyes grew sharper. Your ranch is sitting right on the spring that feeds this whole eastern valley. Elizabeth took in a sharp breath. They are welcome to try, Belle said with a calm voice. My land is not for sale, not for any amount of money. The talk soon turned to other things, like planting times, the upcoming church supper, and the next visit from the circuit judge. But Belle could feel Holt's eyes on her while she finished paying for her things. I will walk with you outside, he offered. Out on the street, with the low hum of the town around them, Holt lowered his voice. Those men, and Mercer most of all, they do not take no for an answer. Bad things happen. Fires, accidents, people losing everything they have. Belle finished tying down her supplies. Are you telling me I should sell my home to a criminal? No, ma'am, Holt said right away. I'm just saying to be cautious. Maybe you could send Rowan to stay with family for a little while. I do not have any family, Belle said, her voice getting a little softer. But I do appreciate your concern. She pulled herself up onto the wagon seat. Holt put a hand on the side of the wagon. There is something else. Mercer was not just asking about your land. Her hands went still on the reins. What was he asking about? Where you came from before you got to Rattlesnake Gulch, Holt said, choosing his words with care. And if you had any special kinds of skills. He did not have to finish his sentence. When Cyrus Holt brought up stories about a widow from this part of the territory, a chill went through Belle that was not from the spring air. People have always loved their stories, Sheriff, she said calmly, especially the ones about women who live by themselves. Holt looked at her for another moment, not quite believing her. Just keep your eyes open, Belle. I will keep a watch on Rook Mercer and his men when they are in town, but my reach only goes so far. I have been taking care of myself and Rowan for a long time, Belle replied. We will be all right. As she steered the wagon down Main Street, her mind was a whirlwind. Mercer knew something, or he guessed enough, to be a real danger. The issue was not if he would push things, but just how far he would push to get what he wanted. The road that led home wound through tall saguaro cactus and blooming ocotillo, their red flowers like fire against the brown dust. The familiar country helped to calm her, letting her think straight. Mercer wanted her spring, probably for Hollis Granger's plans for a railroad. Her refusal had already brought threats, quiet but clear. Now her past was likely the weapon he planned to use. As she reached the top of the last hill before her ranch, Belle saw Rowan riding back from the Willows place. Seeing her daughter's comfortable skill on her horse brought a quick smile to her face. Eamon Knox had taught her to ride before she could even walk, and Rowan had his natural gift with horses. The smile disappeared. For 6 years, Belle had protected Rowan from the whispers that once trailed after quick draw Belle all over the territory. She had made this quiet life so her daughter could have the one thing she never did, a normal childhood. That peace was now slipping through her fingers. When the wagon pulled into the yard, Rowan hopped down from her pinto pony, her cheeks red with excitement. Ma, the Willows filly was finally born. She is pure black with a perfect white star. Nora Willow said I can help train her, if you say it is okay. Belle put on a smile. That is wonderful news. The Willows know good horses, and they see that you do too. Rowan's smile faded a little as she looked closely at her mother. What is the matter? Did something happen when you were in town? It is nothing that you need to be concerned about, Belle said, but the tension in her voice gave her away. Help me with these supplies, and then you and I need to have a talk. Inside the cabin, Belle moved with a clear purpose, checking the locks and looking out the windows. Rowan watched her, feeling more and more worried. She remembered this behavior from a long time ago, when Belle used to jump at every little noise. It is about those men from yesterday, is it not? Rowan finally asked. Sheriff Holt told you something. Belle stopped what she was doing and met her daughter's eyes. At 16 years old, Rowan was not a little girl to be shielded from every harsh truth. Yes, Belle, quietly. They're Hollis Granger's men. He's after our spring. A man like that doesn't take no for an answer. Rowan felt a lump form in her throat. What are we going to do? For now, we get ready, Belle said, walking toward her bedroom. Come on with me. There's something you ought to see. She came to a stop in front of the big trunk at the foot of her bed. Rowan had seen that trunk 1,000 times, even dusted around it, but she never wondered why it was always locked. Belle took a small key from a chain around her neck and lifted the lid. Inside, there were just blankets and winter clothes stacked on top. But then Belle reached underneath them and pushed on a spot Rowan couldn't see. A false bottom clicked open with a soft little noise. Mama, Rowan whispered. Belle lifted out a leather gun belt with beautiful tooling, its twin holsters perfectly shaped for 2 special guns. After that came a pair of soft shooting gloves, the fingertips worn thin from use. Last, she pulled out a leather-bound journal and some yellowed newspaper clippings. There are things about me, about our family, that you don't know, Belle said, sitting down on the bed and patting the spot next to her for Rowan. Things I was hoping you would never have to learn. Rowan picked up one of the clippings, and her eyes went wide when she read the headline. Quick Draw Belle outguns the infamous Blackwell Raiders. This is you, she whispered, her voice barely there. Belle just nodded, taking the paper from her daughter's hands ever so gently. Before I met your father, before you were ever born, this was the life I lived. She held up the empty gun belt. I used to guard shipments for Wells Fargo. Later on, I did shooting exhibitions. I was known all over for my speed, faster than any man in Arizona. But you're a rancher, Rowan said softly, almost protesting. You raise horses. You bake your own bread. You teach Sunday school. I am all of those things now, Belle said. But before your father passed, I was something else entirely. The woman you read about in those papers, Belle said in a low voice. The one they called Quick Draw Belle. Oh, that was me. Rowan just shook her head, finding it hard to connect the calm, gentle mother she knew with the deadly woman frozen in time on that yellowed paper. Why did you never tell me? To keep you safe, Belle answered without a moment's hesitation. After your father was killed in that robbery up in Prescott, I wanted a life for you where you wouldn't have to grow up with folks whispering and staring. The daughter of Quick Draw Belle would have never been allowed to just be Rowan Knox. Rowan picked up another clipping. This one had a drawing of a much younger Belle standing next to a stagecoach, a pair of pistols hanging low on her hips, her stance completely fearless. Is that why we left Prescott? Why we took a different name? Belle nodded. Knox was your father's name. It let us have a fresh start. And those men, Rook Mercer and the others, do they know who you were? I reckon Mercer has his suspicions, Belle said. He said something just as they rode off that made me think so. If he's been asking around, he might try to use my past to run us out of Rattlesnake Gulch. A fire lit in her eyes, quick and hot, but it was there. I won't be chased out of my home again, she said, her voice firm. This is our home, and I will defend it. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, taking it all in. Then she finally asked, Where are the guns, the ones from these pictures? Belle stood up and walked over to the stone fireplace. She knelt down, worked a loose stone free, and reached into the dark space behind it. From that hollow, she pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and unfolded it with great care. 2 matching Colt pistols gleamed in the dim light, their ivory grips and turquoise inlays catching the last rays of the sun. Orrin Blackvein made these for me when I was 25, Belle said, her voice filled with a kind of respect Rowan had never heard before. They were balanced just for my hands. I've never held anything that could match them. Rowan found herself leaning closer. They're beautiful. They're tools, Belle corrected her gently. Their beauty is in how well they were made, but don't you ever forget, they were made for one reason. She wrapped them back up, her movements precise and familiar. And I pray to God you never have to see me use them. As the sun went down over the ranch, Belle began to move with a quiet purpose. She reinforced the doors. She shifted furniture around to create defensive spots. She placed lamps in ways that wouldn't cast shadows against the windows. Rowan watched her, feeling caught between helping and just staring, trying to see how this sharp tactician was the same woman who baked bread and taught Sunday lessons. "What about Sheriff Holt?" Rowan asked while Belle checked the Winchester rifle one more time. "Shouldn't we go tell him?" "Cyrus Holt is a good man," Belle said, not looking up, "but he is badly outmatched. If Granger sends enough men, the sheriff won't be able to stop them. His first duty is to protect the town." A sharp whistle suddenly cut through the night air. 3 short blasts. Belle moved right to the window, rifle already up. Then she relaxed a bit. "It's just Tate Willows," she said, "and he's riding hard." A few moments later, the boy pulled his sweat-soaked horse to a stop. He was 14 years old and all sharp elbows and urgency. His face was red as he leaped from the saddle. "Mrs. Knox," he said, all out of breath, "Pa sent me. There's a group of riders coming from Shadow Creek, at least a dozen of them, and they're all armed. They stopped by our place asking for directions." Tate rushed on. "Pa sent them north up toward the Badlands, but they'll figure out they were tricked soon enough." "When was this?" Belle asked, her voice steady. "Less than 20 minutes ago. Pa said to tell you to get out of here while you still can." Belle put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Tate. Tell your father thank you. Now you ride home, but take the long way. Stay off the main, my trails." After Tate had vanished into the darkness, Belle turned back to Rowan. "Pack a bag with only what you can carry. 1 bag, 5 minutes." "We're leaving?" Rowan asked, surprised. "I told you I wouldn't be driven out," Belle answered. "And I mean it, but you always come first." While Rowan threw things into a bag, Belle went out to the barn. She saddled up 2 horses, Rowan's pinto mare, and her own dependable buckskin gelding. In the saddlebags, she packed ammunition, the oilcloth bundle with the Colts, some food, and the small leather pouch of gold she kept hidden for emergencies. Rowan came out dressed for a long ride, holding a small carpet bag. Belle helped her get on her horse. "We're going to Copper Canyon," she said. "There's an old mining shack up there. It's hidden and easy to defend. You're going to stay there." "You're not coming with me, Tiano," Rowan said, the understanding slowly dawning on her. "No," Belle replied. "Once I know you're safe, I'm coming back." "Hollis Granger wants a fight." "Well, he's about to get one." They rode fast as the night got deeper, sticking to dry washes and animal trails. Belle took the lead, her senses on high alert, always watching for anyone following them. The Colts were at her hips now. Their familiar weight was both a comfort and a heavy warning. Copper Canyon was about 10 miles to the northwest, a confusing maze of rust-colored rock and old, abandoned mining claims. Not many folks ever went out there anymore, but Belle knew it like the back of her hand. She had planned out every escape route the very day they first settled in this valley. The old mining shack was built on a narrow ledge about halfway up the canyon wall. You could only get to it by a steep switchback trail that could be easily defended or even destroyed. As they got closer, Belle got off her horse and led them the last little bit, her eyes scanning every shadow, making sure they were the only ones there. Someone had been through here not too long ago. The shack looked just like Belle remembered, worn down by the weather but still solid as a rock. It had thick plank walls and a heavy door that could be braced shut from the inside. A little spring trickled out of the rock face nearby, the water clear and cool. "It ain't much," Belle said as she helped Rowan get the saddle off the pinto. "But it's safe. I've stored some supplies inside, some food, blankets, even a couple of books." Rowan looked around the small shelter, then turned back to her paws, her eyes shiny with tears she refused to let fall. "I should go with you. We ought to face them together." Belle shook her head just once, but it was firm. "No, Rook Mercer and those cutthroats Granger hired will use anything they can against me. If you're there with me, they'll use you." Her voice got a little softer. "I can't fight the way I might have to if my mind is on worrying about you." "But it's been years, Mama," Rowan said, waving a hand toward the pistols on her mother's hips. "You haven't? Some things you learn, you never forget," Belle answered. There was a hard edge in her voice that Rowan had never heard. "They just go to sleep for a while until you need to wake them up." As they tied up the horses in a small, sheltered alcove and carried the supplies inside, Rowan could feel the change in her mother. The careful, quiet widow was disappearing, and someone sharper was taking her place. Belle's movements became more efficient. Her senses seemed to reach out farther, and her voice was steady and full of command. "I'm leaving you my Winchester," Belle said, checking the rifle one last time before leaning it against the wall by the door. "You remember how to use it?" Rowan nodded. Her father had taught her the basics a long time ago. Belle had quietly made sure she never forgot them over the years. "Aim for the middle. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. And only if you have no other choice." A small, faint smile touched Belle's lips. "Eamon taught you well." She set a box of extra cartridges on the rough wooden table. "I'll be back by dawn if my luck holds out." "And if it doesn't?" Rowan asked, the fear finally creeping into her voice. "Wait 3 days," Belle said, "not a day longer. Then you take the North Trail to Hawkins Junction. Find a marshal named Kingsley. He rode with your father once. He will help you." As Belle turned to go, Rowan grabbed her arm. "Wait, before you go, tell me the truth. That story about 10 outlaws in 10 seconds, was it real?" Belle's eyes seemed to look far away, back into a memory. "It was in '72. The Blackwell gang tried to rob the Territorial Bank. I was guarding that shipment." She looked down at the pistols on her hips. 10 men, 10 shots, 10 seconds. "I didn't miss." "How?" Rowan whispered, her voice a mix of horror and complete awe. "Practice," Belle said simply. "Hours and hours, every single day, for years. My own father started teaching me before I was your age. He always said a woman out here had to know how to protect herself." Belle looked straight into Rowan's eyes. This was never for show. First, it was just about staying alive. Then it turned into a job. "And now," Rowan whispered. "Now it is about keeping you safe," Belle answered. Her hands moved over her pistols, a familiar motion that time had not forgotten. "For you and for this place we built." She placed a kiss on Rowan's forehead. "Bolt that door tight after I leave. Do not open it for a soul, you hear? Only for me and only when you hear the knock. 3 times, then 4, then 2. The moment Belle rode off, the shift was complete. The woman who baked fresh bread and taught lessons on Sunday was gone. In her place was quick draw Belle. Every nerve was alert, her mind already mapping out the land and her first move. The moon climbed over the canyon as she took a path along the ridge, staying away from the trail she used before. She needed the high ground, a spot where she could watch without being watched. 6 years of quiet living had not softened her one bit. The familiar heft of her Colts felt natural, like those peaceful years were just a long breath, not the end of the fight. From her perch above the ranch, the night was now black as pitch. Down below, lanterns danced in the dark. A good dozen men, at least, were crawling all over her property. Their horses were penned up in her pasture and smoke was rising from her own chimney. A pure, hot anger flared up inside her. They had come into the one safe place she had made for Rowan. Belle raised her field glasses, watching every man, tracking every move. She saw Rook Mercer down there, barking orders as his crew tossed her house and searched the property. He was getting annoyed. They clearly thought she and Rowan would be waiting for them. Just then a rider she recognized came into the yard. It was that nervous young fellow who rode with Mercer a while back. He jumped off his horse and hurried right over to Mercer. He was moving like his boots were on fire, but she was too far to catch what was said. Belle could read the panic in his posture just fine. The young man spoke quickly. Rook Mercer went rigid, his whole body tight with anger. He barked out some new commands. In a flash, his men were on their horses, breaking off into 3 different pauses. Belle's gaze sharpened. That was a search formation. They knew. Somehow they knew Rowan was not there. If they fanned out like that, one of them was bound to wander into Copper Canyon. That was the one thing she could not allow. Belle considered what to do next. Her first thought was to lie low, pick them off one by one from afar if they stuck around. But the danger was too high now. A different plan began to form. She had to draw them all to her and lead them away from Rowan. There was only one sure way to do that. Belle gave her pistols a final check, then nudged her buckskin horse down the rocky slope toward the ranch. Quick Draw Belle was fixing to announce her arrival. Back in Rattlesnake Gulch, things had gone quiet at the Dusty Boot Saloon. A nervous feeling had taken hold of the place. News gets around quick in a small town. Granger's men had been asking after the Knox ranch, and now Belle and Rowan were missing. Sheriff Cyrus Holt was standing at the bar. He had a full glass of whiskey in his hand, but had not taken a sip. Worry was carved right into his face. Next to him, Silas Moore leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "Tate Willows came through about an hour ago," Silas whispered. "He said Granger has a dozen men, maybe more, on their way to the Knox place. You planning on riding out, Cyrus?" Silas asked. The sheriff's hand squeezed the glass a little tighter. 12 armed men, Silas. I would need a proper posse for that, and it seems like half the folks in this town work for Granger now. But it is a woman and a young girl out there, Silas insisted. It just is not right to leave them to whatever Granger has planned. You think I do not know that? Holt shot back, then took a breath to calm himself. Riding in with guns blazing is not going to help anybody. The saloon doors swung wide open. All the talking stopped as Hollis Granger walked in. He was dressed sharp, with silver hair, and had two men with guns standing behind him. He looked around the room like he owned it and everyone in it. His eyes found Holt, and a slick smile spread across his face as he walked to the bar. "Sheriff," Granger said, his voice smooth as silk. "A fine evening." Holt looked him over for a second. "We do not see you much in Rattlesnake Gulch." "Business," Granger said, waving to the bartender for a drink. "I have just acquired some land in the area." "Acquired?" Holt repeated it, and his voice got a little harder. "That is a strange way to put it. Most folks would call sending a dozen armed men after a woman and her child something else entirely." Granger's face stayed smooth, but his eyes went cold as ice. "Just a simple misunderstanding. My men were trying to negotiate a fair price for the property. That spring is essential for my new venture." "Ms. Knox told you plain that her land is not for sale," Holt said, "and the way your men negotiate usually ends with fire and busted bones." Granger took the whiskey the bartender handed him and took a slow sip. "Be careful, Sheriff. A man needs proof to make claims like that." Every person in that saloon was watching them. Granger stood for the new way of things, all about railroads and progress and making money no matter who got hurt. Holt was a man of the old ways, where the law, the land, and the folks on it came first. "Let me make myself clear," Holt said, putting his glass down firmly on the bar. "If anything happens to Belle Knox or her girl, I am holding you to account for it." For just a second, Granger's polite expression cracked. "That badge of yours can only do so much," he said in a low voice. "It is not going to stop a bullet." Holt's hand moved down, resting near the butt of his gun. "Neither will your money." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then the doors flew open, and Tate Willows was standing there, breathing hard from a long, fast ride. "Sheriff," he yelled out, "they got to the Knox Ranch, but it was empty. They are on their trail now, heading up toward Copper Canyon." All the blood drained out of Sheriff Holt's face. He knew those canyons. They were a death trap even in broad daylight. Granger's cold smile came back. "It appears Ms. Knox decided to run instead of talk business. A smart woman. I will make sure my men pay her for her trouble." Holt spun around, all his patience gone. "If they so much as harm a single hair on their heads, there is not a hole in this territory deep enough for you to hide in. I do not care if you have the governor in your pocket." He marched toward the door, his mind already racing, trying to figure out how many men he could get to ride with him. He knew it was not going to be enough. Just as he got to the door, Granger's voice, slick and dangerous, stopped him. "Just one more thing, Sheriff," Hollis Granger said. "You ever wonder why that woman holds on so tight to that worthless piece of land? Or maybe you should ask yourself who she really is." Cyrus Holt stopped in his tracks. The weight of those words hit him like a physical blow. "What in the world are you talking about?" Granger's smile got wider and sharper. "The folks I talk to say Belle Knox is not her real name. You should ask her about what happened in Prescott. Ask about that bank robbery back in '72. Ask her why she changed her name from Belle Sloan to Belle Knox right before she showed up here." Sheriff Holt's face tensed up as all the little pieces started falling into place. The way she always took care of herself, how she kept everyone at a distance, the easy way she held a rifle at the shooting competition last autumn. "Quick draw, Belle," Granger said, his voice almost a whisper, enjoying every second of it. "They say she was the fastest shot in all of Arizona territory back in the day. The legend says she quit after her husband passed. Looks like she has been living a quiet life right here, and you never suspected a thing. Holt's mind was spinning. If what Granger said was true, then his men were not just chasing a widow. They were riding straight into a storm they had no idea was coming. Belle led her buckskin horse quietly over the rough terrain. She had wrapped the horse's hooves in burlap to muffle the sound. The cool night air and the familiar heaviness of the pistols on her hips brought back feelings she had tried to lock away a long time ago. A stagecoach. She remembered the rush of bandit trails and the sound of a crowd holding its breath as her pistol cleared the holster in a flash. Now, from a thicket of forgotten mesquite trees, she watched her own ranch. Lanterns cast a nervous light across the yard. 8 horses were still there. That meant 4 of the riders were out searching. Inside her cabin, shadows moved past the windows. 2 armed men walked the property line back and forth. Belle rubbed her thumb over the smooth turquoise set in the handle of her left pistol. It was an old habit, a silent promise to herself. 6 quiet years had not dulled her senses one bit. The plan formed in her mind, sharp and clear. First, she would take out the guards. Then, she would create a distraction. Finally, she would face Rook Mercer inside her home. She tied her buckskin horse and slipped off her long duster coat, showing the fitted leather vest she wore underneath. She checked every bullet in her Colts by touch alone. They were custom-made by Orrin Blackvein, and they were perfect. She started to move. The first guard did not even hear her coming. Belle's arm wrapped around his throat, silencing him completely. She laid him down softly, then tied and gagged him with an expert speed. The second man heard a small sound she made on purpose and turned. Before he could raise his rifle, Belle was already on him. One hand pushed the gun barrel away, while the other hand struck a nerve at the base of his neck. He collapsed without a sound and was quickly tied up. Now it was time for the diversion. She crept to the barn, took a small jar of coal oil from her saddlebag, and soaked a few rags. She did not want to burn the place down, just cause a little panic. A single flame near the hayloft would be enough. Just as she struck the match, the sound of hooves pounded into the yard. 3 riders appeared in the lantern light. Rook Mercer was one of them, along with his anxious young partner. The young man reported they found nothing at Copper Creek. He said the other men were still checking Devil's Ridge. Mercer snapped back, "Keep looking. She knows these canyons better than we do." At that moment, the barn burst into flames and men started shouting. The crew poured out of the cabin and ran toward the fire. Belle used the confusion to slip in through the kitchen door. Inside, her anger burned hotter than the fire outside. There were muddy boot prints all over her clean floors. Her kitchen table was covered with maps. A bottle of Granger's expensive brandy sat right where she and Rowan used to eat their meals. Only one man was left inside, shoving papers into a leather bag. It was Abel Crowhurst. He froze when he heard the double click of 2 pistol hammers being pulled back. "Those papers belong to me," Belle said in a calm voice. "Put them down." Crowhurst turned around slowly, his face turning pale. "Mrs. Knox," he stammered, "this is just a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding here," she said, cutting him off. "You are trespassing on my property. You have 1 minute to get your men and leave, or I am going to remind you all why some stories never really die." Outside, Mercer felt something was wrong. He turned, his hand starting to move toward his gun. "I would not do that," Belle called out, her eyes still locked on Crowhurst. "Not unless you want to end up in the same place as the Blackwell Raiders. That is where men who draw on me usually go." Mercer stopped cold. He finally recognized her, and the truth hit him like a punch. He leaned against the doorway, his eyes wide with a growing sense of wonder. "It really is you," he whispered. "Quick draw, Belle, right here in front of me." Belle Knox replied in a steady voice, "Now call your men off my barn and get on your horses. You have worn out your welcome in Rattlesnake Gulch." Rook Mercer's surprise turned into a cold calculation. "You have been living a soft life for years," he said. "Playing the part of a rancher's widow makes you lose your edge. Your reflexes get slow when you do not use them." Belle's smile was all ice. "Are you offering to test that theory?" The silence in the room was stretched as tight as a guitar string. Belle kept both men in her sights, as steady as a rock, while Mercer tried to figure out his chances. Outside, the fire in the barn was already dying down. It was never meant to cause real damage, just to get everyone's attention. Men were calling for Mercer, confused and waiting for orders. "You are outnumbered," Mercer finally said. 8-1. "I have faced worse odds," Belle answered calmly, her mind flashing back to a fiery shootout in Prescott. "And I only plan on shooting the ones who make me." She paused, then added, "That starts with you, Mercer, if your fingers so much as twitch toward that pistol." Before he could say another word, the sound of more horses tore into the yard. A lot of riders were coming in fast. Belle did not move a muscle. Her senses were sharp as a razor as she listened, trying to figure out who it was. "That will be the rest of Granger's men," Mercer said, his confidence returning. "They have been searching the canyons. If they found your daughter—" He never got to finish that sentence. Belle's left Colt pistol snapped up and fired. The lamp next to Mercer exploded into a shower of glass and oil before he even saw her hand move. Her right Colt pistol never left Abel Crowhurst, who was frozen in place, the papers shaking in his hand. "The next bullet takes off your ear," Belle said in a quiet voice. "Say my daughter's name one more time." A new voice, firm and clear, cut through all the noise. "Granger's men, this is Sheriff Cyrus Holt. You are surrounded by a territorial posse. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands where we can see them." Belle felt a wave of relief, but she did not lower her guns. Not just yet. The next few moments were a blur of activity. Men were shouting orders, and guns were being thrown to the ground. You could hear the captured men cursing as they were taken into custody. Mercer's face was a mask of pure hatred as he understood what had happened. "This is not over, Belle. Granger will—" "Granger will what?" a smooth voice asked. Hollis Granger himself stood in the doorway. He looked perfectly neat, even at this late hour, his silver hair shining in the lamplight. Behind him, Sheriff Holt pressed a revolver firmly into his back. For the first time all night, Belle Knox looked truly surprised. "Cyrus, you brought Granger himself," she said. "I found him riding this way with a few of his men," Holt explained, giving him a little push forward. "I figured he wanted to see his big investment for himself." Granger's eyes scanned the room. He saw his lawyer, frozen under Belle's steady aim. He saw Mercer, covered in lamp oil. And he saw the widow, standing in the middle of it all like a coiled rattlesnake. "Mrs. Knox," Granger said politely, "or maybe I should call you Belle Sloan. I have heard a lot about you, though I have to admit, I always thought the stories about your quick draw were a little exaggerated." "Most stories are," Belle replied, her gun still up. "The true ones do not need any extra help." Granger's look became more intense. "Where is your daughter?" "She is somewhere you will never find her," Belle said, her voice cold. "And the name is Knox. It has been for 6 years." Holt motioned to his deputies. They hauled Mercer and Crowhurst outside in handcuffs. "Granger was very talkative on the ride over," Holt added, "especially after I told him that Judson Vale is arriving tomorrow with warrants for land fraud, coercion, and bribery. It is quite a long list." "That is all hearsay," Granger scoffed. "None of it will hold up in court." "We will let a judge decide that," Holt replied. "For tonight you are under arrest for planning an armed invasion." As the prisoners were being led away, Belle finally lowered her Colt pistols, but she kept them in her hands, her eyes fixed on Granger. "You came all the way across the territory for my little spring," she said. "Why is this land so important?" Granger looked at her, seeing her strength and respecting it. "Your spring feeds the entire eastern water table. The railroad surveys confirmed it. If you control the water, you control the route. And if you control the route, you control the future. It is just simple economics." "It got personal when you threatened my daughter," Belle said, her voice like velvet covering solid steel. Granger gave a small, cold smile. "Leverage is a part of business. A woman like you should understand that." "Oh, I understand," Belle replied, "and you made a very bad calculation." His hand moved like lightning, but Belle was faster. Her right pistol fired with a loud crack. The bullet grazed the back of Granger's hand. A second shot sent his expensive hat flying across the room. Holt slammed him up against the wall and pulled a small Derringer pistol from his vest. "Good Lord," Holt breathed out, staring at the perfectly neat hole that went right through the hat. Granger held his bleeding hand, a mixture of shock and grudging respect in his eyes. "Now that," he said in a hoarse voice, Was Quick Draw Bell, the real one from the legends. Bell answered softly. The legends were always a bit restrained. Outside, the posse finished securing the yard. The night that had started with an invasion was ending with the quiet clink of iron handcuffs. The threat was over, handled by the law instead of with more bloodshed. Still, Belle Knox put her Colts back in their holsters in one smooth, practiced motion. It was the kind of move that comes from years and years of practice, where the muscles remember what to do before the mind even has to think. I need to go bring Rowan home, she said to Cyrus Holt, already walking toward the door. I will send a few deputies with you, the sheriff offered. Belle just shook her head. No need. No one was able to follow me out there. Your men are needed here to guard these varmints you have caught. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at Hollis Granger. He was tied to one of her kitchen chairs, and you could see the fury boiling just beneath his calm expression. When I get back, Belle said calmly, we are going to have a talk about how you are going to sign over the water rights for this entire Eastern Valley to the Fenway Board. For good. Granger's eyes went wide. That is robbery. No, Belle corrected him, a dangerous glint in her eyes. That is the price you pay for threatening my family and living to tell about it. The Blackwell Raiders paid a whole lot more for doing a whole lot less. The ride back to Copper Canyon felt much shorter this time. Her worry was now replaced with a deep sense of relief. Belle pushed her buckskin horse hard as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky. By the time she got to the hidden trail that led to the old mining shack, the stars were already starting to fade. Rowan, she called out softly, using their special signal. 3 knocks, a short pause, then 2 more knocks. The door creaked open. Rowan Knox was standing there, holding a Winchester rifle tightly. When she saw her mother was alone and safe, she dropped the rifle and ran forward, hugging Belle with all her might. You are safe, Rowan whispered, pulling back to look at her mother's face. Did they come? Did you have to? They came, Belle said gently, leading her daughter inside the shack. But Sheriff Holt showed up with a posse. Granger and his men are now in jail. She did not tell her the details. The quickness, the gunfire, the deadly accuracy. Some things are better left unsaid. So it is all done? Rowan asked, and a little bit of hope shone in her eyes. Can we go back home now? It is done, Belle confirmed, for the most part. They gathered their small camp and got ready to leave. While they worked, Rowan looked at her mother in a new light. She was not just seeing the quiet woman who raised her. She was seeing the legend that had just saved them from being destroyed. Those guns, Rowan said finally, giving a nod to the pistols on Belle's hip. Are you going to put them away again? Are you going back to just being Ms. Knox? Belle ran her thumb over the smooth turquoise set in the handle. I am not sure we can ever go all the way back, she said honestly. A person's past has a habit of catching up to them, no matter how fast they ride. They left as the first light of the sun touched the top of the canyon cliffs. Mother and daughter rode together, pointed toward a new life that neither of them could quite see yet. It was a life built on the truth, on what happened, and on the decisions they still had to make. 3 days after it all went down, Rattlesnake Gulch was humming, with more excitement than it had seen in a long time. A territorial marshal named Judson Vale showed up with his deputies, and the little town jail became the busiest place around. Granger and all his hired guns were locked up, filling every cell. They even had to build a temporary pen out back for the rest of them. Belle was sitting on her porch as the sun went down, watching the golden light spread over the land. Her pistols were not on her hips anymore. They were clean, oiled, and put away again. But this time they were not a secret. She heard a horse coming. It was Cyrus Holt, riding up by himself. He looked tired down to the bone. Evening, Belle, Deddo, he said as he tied his horse to the rail. I thought you might want to hear the news. She pointed to the empty chair next to her. You better sit down before you fall down. You look like you have not slept a wink since this whole mess started. Holt let out a long breath. Marshal Vale has been questioning everyone around the clock. Granger's lawyer finally gave in when he saw all the proof. Turns out Granger wrote down every single bribe and every threat he ever made. Said it was for his own protection. Clever man, Belle noted. There is not much honor between men like that. Holt watched her face in the dying light. He could see the woman he had known for years, and he could also see the legend he had just learned about. Granger is being moved to Prescott in the morning. The judge up there is not too fond of powerful men who think they are above the law. Belle gave a small, pleased nod. And what about Rook Mercer? Attempted murder, trespassing, and conspiracy, Holt said with a grim voice. He will either face a rope or 20 years in a federal prison. A quiet moment passed between them, with just the smell of sage in the air. Where is Rowan? Holt finally asked. She is inside, Belle said quietly, writing notes to her teacher to explain why she was not in school. Holt nodded slowly. Folks in town are talking. I reckon they are. Some of them are mighty impressed, Holt said, choosing his words with care. Even a little awestruck. And the others? Belle asked. Holt looked her right in the eye. Some of them are scared. Belle turned her gaze back to the skyline where the last bit of daylight was fading away. Well, I suppose they will just have to choose which thing is worth being scared of. Your name was not just about being fast with a gun, Cyrus Holt said in a low voice. You protected stagecoaches. You brought in wanted men. Kept honest folks safe, but now folks are scratching their heads about it. They're wondering why you kept it a secret, what other secrets you might be sitting on. He looked her square in the eye. So tell me, Belle, how does it feel having a known gunfighter right here in my town? There was a bit of a dare in his question, but Belle Knox's voice stayed steady. And you, Sheriff, what do you reckon? Holt took a long moment before he answered. I reckon I've known Catherine Sullivan for 6 years. I've watched her raise a daughter all on her own, build a ranch with her own 2 hands, and help this town in quiet ways that never got any attention. He turned to face her completely. Whatever name you went by before, whatever life you lived, that's the woman I know. He paused for a breath. The real question is, what are you fixing to do now? Belle's eyes drifted over to the dark shape of the mountains. I've been asking myself that very thing since the night Granger went down. Will the good people of Rattlesnake Gulch let Quick Draw Belle live here among them? Will they still let their children play with Rowan? Or will the whispers start up, the sideways glances, the extra space folks leave when you walk down the street? Before Holt could say a word, the front door creaked open and Rowan Knox stepped out onto the porch. At 16, she stood taller now, more sure of herself, older, like the past few days had aged her more than years ever could. Sheriff, she said, giving him a respectful nod. Then she turned to her mother. Ma, Silas Moore sent word. Our supply order is ready. He said there's no rush. He'll keep it for us. The message behind the words was plain as day. Silas was giving Belle some time, offering her a way to keep her distance if she needed it. Thank you, Rowan, Belle said. You tell him we'll be in tomorrow. There's no sense in putting off what needs to be faced. When Rowan went back inside, Holt watched Belle's face. So you're staying. You're not going to run this time. We've made a home here, Belle answered, plain and simple. Running never solved a thing before. It just pushed back the day of reckoning. Her hand moved on its own, resting on the spot where her Colts used to hang. And I'm tired of hiding, Cyrus. Tired of living half a life, always looking over my shoulder for the past to come calling. Holt nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. This town needs good people, no matter what their story is. As night started to settle over the ranch, Holt got ready to leave, promising he would come back the next day to ride into town with Belle and Rowan. That offer was more than just good manners. It was a show of support. Belle stayed out on the porch long after his horse was gone, just watching the stars pop out one by one in the big desert sky. 6 years ago, after Ian Knox passed, she truly believed that burying Quick Draw Belle was the only way to give her daughter a normal life. Now, that little world she'd built so carefully had come apart. Whatever came next would mean she had to be both women at once, not fighting each other, but finding a way to be whole. Inside, the soft glow of a lamp lit up Rowan sitting at the kitchen table. Her school books were open, but it was clear her mind was a long way off. You ought to be in bed, Belle said softly, putting the kettle on the stove. Tomorrow is not going to be easy. Rowan closed her book and looked right at her mother. Is it going to be real hard? Going into town and facing everybody? Belle thought on the question, not wanting to sugarcoat the truth. People are going to stare. Some will whisper behind their hands, and some might just walk the other way. Because they're scared of you? Rowan asked, her voice a mix of pride and worry. Some of them, Belle admitted. Others because they'll feel like we fooled them. When folks think they know somebody and then find out they didn't, not really, it can feel like they've been betrayed. Rowan took that in without a word. Would it have been better if you just told them right from the start? If you hadn't hidden who you were? The question hit Belle hard. I don't know, she finally said. When your father died, all I wanted was some peace. A place where you could grow up without my name following you around. Where you weren't known as Quick Draw, Belle's daughter, before you were just yourself. But I am your daughter, Rowan said, her voice strong. Hiding it didn't change that one bit. It just meant I didn't know the whole story of who I am or who we are. The kettle started to whistle, giving Belle a moment to pull herself together. She poured 2 cups of tea, adding a spoonful of honey to Rowan's, a small comfort they both shared. You're right, Belle said, sitting back down at the table. I thought I was keeping you safe, but maybe I was just putting off the truth. She held the warm cup in her hands. No more secrets, Rowan. Not between us. Rowan nodded. Good. Then tomorrow we ride into town as ourselves, and if some people can't handle that, well, that's their loss. A small smile touched Belle's lips. When did you get to be so smart? Rowan gave a little smirk. Must have got it from you, along with a few other things I'm just now starting to see. Her face turned serious again. Will you teach me, Ma? Not just how to shoot, but everything. How to track, how to move without a sound, how to see trouble coming before it gets here. Belle looked at her daughter, seeing the same determination that had once pushed her through her own training. You understand what you're asking. Once you learn these things, you can't ever unlearn them. They change the way you see the whole world. I'm sure, Rowan said without a second of doubt. I've spent 16 years not knowing the half of who my own mother is. I don't want to live like that another day. As the tea cooled down in their cups, Belle Knox's mind was already moving forward, laying out a careful plan. Not to create another legend like Quick Draw, but to give Rowan Knox the skills she would need to make it in a world that wasn't always kind to a woman on her own. It hit her right then that this knowledge, something she had hidden away out of fear and sadness, could now be a gift that came from being honest. The morning came up clean and bright, the kind of autumn sunrise that made the desert feel almost gentle. Belle dressed carefully, not in the sad black she had worn since Ian Knox died, but in a deep blue riding skirt and a fitted jacket. It was a color that caught the morning light and seemed to soften the silver streaks in her hair. The outfit was practical, made for moving, but it was also without a doubt the dress of a lady. Rowan watched her mother change with a quiet wonder, and then she chose her own best Sunday dress. Her dark hair was braided and pinned up neat, a silent sign that she had crossed a line from being a girl into something more steady. No guns today? Rowan asked, seeing the empty space at her mother's hips. Belle shook her head. Not today. This isn't about putting on a show with a fast draw. This is about all of me finding my proper place. Cyrus Holt showed up right on time, just like he said he would. The look on his face told them he had news that made the day feel even heavier. Hollis Granger signed over the water rights this morning, he said as they got on their horses. Gave them completely to the Fenway board. Didn't take a penny for him. Belle's eyebrows went up. That doesn't sound like a man who's given up the fight. Judson Vale laid out his choices for him real clear, Holt answered with a hint of grim satisfaction. Especially with the proof we have, which could put Granger away for a long, long time. But there's something else. The council called a special meeting for noon. They specifically asked you to be there. A flicker of doubt crossed Belle's face. Did they say what for? Nope, but Elizabeth Moore sure looked happy. If that's any clue. Holt studied her for a moment. You're not scared. Belle let a small smile show. Facing down armed men is a whole lot simpler than facing down people's judgment. The ride into Rattlesnake Gulch felt like it went by too fast. As they came over the last hill, Belle pulled her horse to a stop, just looking at the town spread out below. It wasn't just a place they lived anymore. It was a home that was about to either accept her or turn her away. You ready? Holt asked. Belle sat up straighter in her saddle, lifting her chin in a way Rowan knew so well. As I'll ever be. Their arrival surely got noticed, conversations died down, and heads turned to watch them. Belle rode straight on, not flinching, just giving steady nods to the faces she knew until they stopped in front of Silas Moore's general store. Silas was standing in the doorway, and his weathered face broke into a real, honest-to-goodness grin. "Mrs. Knox," he called out on purpose, "and Miss Rowan, your supplies are ready, but Elsbeth says you have to come in for coffee first." The invitation was clear as a bell. It was acceptance, right out in public. Inside, Elsbeth gave them both a big, warm hug. "Lord have mercy, you had us worried sick," she said, leading them to the back room where coffee and fresh cinnamon rolls were waiting. "Next time you decide to face down a dozen armed men, you at least send a message so your friends can bring more than just their prayers." Belle let out a soft laugh, a lump of emotion in her throat. "Next time I'll send out formal invitations." "You'd better," Elsbeth said with a firm nod, pouring coffee into fancy china cups that seemed out of place way out here. "Now, about this council meeting. You have any idea what they want?" "Not a one," Belle said. "Just that they sent for me." Elsbeth's smile turned into a knowing look. "Well, I have heard a few things, but I'll let them tell you themselves." She turned to Rowan. "Come on, young lady. I've got some new fabric in from back east. It'd be perfect for the harvest dance." As Rowan followed her, Silas lowered his voice. "Most folks are more impressed than they are shocked, Belle. Quick Draw Belle was a legend long before you ever set foot here." "And the ones who aren't?" Belle asked. Silas just shrugged. "Can't please everybody, never could. But the people worth knowing judge a person by what they do, not by old stories." The town bell started to clang, calling the meeting to order. Belle put her cup down, squared her shoulders. She set her jaw as she stepped back onto the main street, which was now packed with the curious and the waiting. It seemed news of the meeting had spread like a brush fire, drawing out nearly every soul in Rattlesnake Gulch. The crowd did not part for Belle Knox. Instead, it moved with her, a current of people flowing by her side as if they were her escort. Up on the town hall steps, Sheriff Cyrus Holt was waiting for her arm. Her daughter, Rowan Knox, stood right there with Hisham. Rowan's eyes held a little flicker of excitement, which was all the proof Belle needed that Elmore had let on about what was coming. Holt spoke, his voice steady. "The council is ready." He offered Belle his arm, a formal gesture you did not see much in a place this rough. "Shall we go in?" With her daughter on one side and the sheriff on the other, Belle climbed those steps, feeling solid and calm, ready for whatever judgment the town had made about the woman who had lived among them so quietly for 6 long years. Inside, the Fenway board was already seated at their big table, with Ulrich Fenway right in the middle. The hall was full to bursting. Every single eye in the place turned to Belle when she walked in, filled with curiosity, but not a hint of malice. "Mrs. Knox," Fenway started, making a point to use the name she went by. "Or should I say, Mrs. Sloane, the council has called you here to talk about some things that have come up lately." Belle stood tall, her hands folded peacefully in front of her. "I am ready to answer any questions the council might have," she said, and her voice was clear enough to reach every corner of the room. Fenway took a quick look at the other men on the council. "These recent events have shown us 2 things, a grave danger to our community and a resource we did not know we had within it. Hollis Granger's scheme to steal our water rights was stopped, and we have your unique skills to thank for that." A low buzz of conversation moved through the people packed in the hall. "This council has the job of protecting the future of Rattlesnake Gulch," Fenway went on. "With the railroad set to arrive next year, we are going to see more folks, new settlers, and the trouble that always follows. Sheriff Holt has done a fine job for us, but he is just one man, and he cannot watch over a territory that is growing like this one is." Holt shifted his weight next to Belle, a small, knowing smile on his face. "For that reason," Fenway declared, "the council has voted as one to create a new position, Deputy Marshal of Rattlesnake Gulch and the Eastern Territories. This person will be in charge of the ranch lands outside of the town limits, and we would like to offer that job to you, Mrs. Knox." A deep silence fell over the room. It was not rejection, and it was not banishment. It was respect. "You want to pin a badge on me?" Belle said, the surprise clear in her voice. "With my history?" Fenway simply nodded. "We want to make official what you have already shown yourself to be, a protector of this town, no matter what your name used to be or what life you used to live." As the weight of his words sank in, Belle felt a change inside her. The two pieces of her life, which she had kept separate for so long, were finally starting to come together. 3 months later, winter had laid its blanket over the Arizona territory. A light snow, something you did not see often, had dusted the mesas white. It made Rattlesnake Gulch look like a picture postcard from back east. The change in the land was a perfect match for the changes in Belle Knox's life. Steady, sure, and here to stay. The silver badge pinned to her vest glinted in the morning sun as she looked over the newly built addition to the jail. With the railroad on its way, the extra cells were a plain and simple need. It was all about getting ready for the drifters and the fast talkers that the iron rails always brought with them. "This is solid work," Bell told Simon Fletcher, the man who built it. "Good sight lines, no corners to hide in." Fletcher broke into a grin. "Built it to keep folks in, Marshal Knox. Nobody is getting out of this place easy." Her real title was Deputy Marshal, but the townspeople just shortened it. After thinking on it for a bit, Belle had taken the council's offer, but with her own conditions. She kept her ranch and handled the law in the lands beyond Sheriff Holt's town duties. The whole setup worked out just fine. Holt took care of the day-to-day business in town. Out in the surrounding country, just the fact that Belle was around was enough to keep most trouble from starting. When something did happen, it did not usually end with bullets. The reputation of the woman they once called Quick Draw Belle was often all it took. "Ma," Rowan called from outside. "Telegram's here from Prescott." Belle walked out into the cold, bright day and found her daughter sitting on her Pinto, her breath making little clouds in the chilly air. Almost 17 now, Rowan had a comfortable confidence about her. A practical gun belt was wrapped around her waist. She did not carry two pistols like her mother once did, but a single Remington and a good hunting knife. Belle broke the seal on the telegram and read it. Her face did not change, but a little bit of tension flickered deep in her eyes. "Granger's trial is over," she finally said. She tucked the telegram into the inside pocket of her vest. "Guilty on all counts," Belle Knox said, her voice low. 20 years in the territorial prison. They took everything he owned to pay back the people he wronged." Rowan Knox watched her mother's face closely. "That is good news, is it not? How come you do not look relieved?" Belle looked down Main Street, where the townspeople were going about their mourning. A few of them gave her a respectful nod as they walked by. The silver badge on her chest was now as much a part of her as her skill with horses or her steady seat at Sunday school. "Come take a walk with me," Belle said. She led their horses toward the edge of town, where things were quieter and there were not so many ears to listen in. As soon as they were out of sight, Belle started talking again. "Hollis Granger had some powerful friends, men who are not the forgiving type, men who like to keep their own hands clean." Rowan took this in, her brow furrowed. "You think they will send someone for you?" "Maybe," Belle answered. "Or maybe they will go looking for an easier mark. Men like his friends do not usually face trouble straight on. They use threats, pressure, and they look for weak spots." Her eyes moved to her daughter. "That is the reason I have been teaching you all the things I know. Not to make you a gunfighter, but so you can spot danger before it bears its fangs." For the past few months, Belle had been teaching Rowan lessons that were once just for staying alive. She taught her how to shoot, of course, but also how to read tracks, how to read people, and how to notice when something just was not right. Rowan had taken to it all like a duck to water, learning fast and figuring things out even faster. "I have been thinking about all that," Rowan said as they got to the overlook, where they could see their ranch down in the valley, "about what is next for the both of us." Belle just raised an eyebrow and waited. "Nora Willows got a letter from her sister out in San Francisco," Rowan went on. "There is a college for women there. They teach literature, science, even how to be a doctor." "You are thinking about going," Belle said, her voice gentle. Rowan nodded, and you could see both excitement and fear wrestling in her eyes. "Before, when I just thought we were ranchers, my future looked pretty simple. I would get married, have a family, and maybe run the ranch someday. But now," she said, waving her hand at everything that had changed, "now I know our story is about more than just getting by. It is about making your own way, even if it is not what anyone expects." A wave of pride washed over Belle, strong enough to push away her own selfish worries. "Your father would have been so proud," she said. "Ian Knox always said that a good education should not just be for the sons." But what about you? Rowan asked. If I go all the way to San Francisco, you will be here all by yourself. Belle gave her a small, soft smile. I got by on my own long before you came along, and I am not really alone here now. She gestured back toward the town. Besides, every person deserves to have their own story. My story was never meant to be yours. The sound of hoofbeats suddenly cut through the quiet moment. A rider was coming up fast from the direction of Copper Canyon. Belle's hand automatically drifted down toward her pistol, and she only relaxed when she saw it was Tate Willows. He was 17 now and splitting his time between the telegraph office and his family's ranch. Marshal Knox, Tate called out, pulling his horse to a sudden stop. Sheriff Holt sent me. What has happened? Belle asked, her senses already on high alert. The stagecoach coming from Tucson was hit over at Sidewinder Pass. The driver was killed and 2 of the passengers are hurt. The rest of them are hunkered down at the way station. Belle's face grew hard. Any idea who did it? Tate paused for a second. They left something, a kind of calling card. What kind of card? Belle asked, though a cold feeling told her she already knew the answer. An ace of spades. That name hung in the air between them like smoke after a gunshot. The ace of spades had been the mark of the Blackwell Raiders. That was the same gang Belle had shattered all those years ago during the Prescott bank robbery. All of them but one. Cornelius Blackwell had run that day, choosing to escape rather than face her in a draw. The story said he had disappeared south or west and was never coming back. If that is really Blackwell, Belle said slowly, then he is either a fool for coming back or someone else is using his old sign to send a message. Rowan thought about that. Either way, it spells trouble. Belle nodded. Either way, it is something I have to look into. She turned back to Tate. You go tell Cyrus Holt I will meet the posse at Coyote Creek in 1 hour. As Tate spurred his horse and rode back to town, Belle looked at her daughter. The old familiar question was there between them. Would Belle ride off into danger while Rowan was left behind to wait? Come with me. Belle said, making a choice that would have been impossible just a few months ago. Not for the chase, just as far as the way station. Those folks will need some tending to, and you know a thing or two about field medicine. A light came on in Rowan's face. I will go get my kit. An hour later, Belle was riding at the front of an 8-man posse, her deputy marshal's badge shining in the winter sun. The matched Colt pistols were settled on her hips. Rowan rode right beside her, a rifle in its saddle scabbard and her medical bag packed neat and tight. The people of the town came out to see them go. From the middle of the crowd, Elith Moore stepped out, said, her worry making her usually sharp tone much softer. You must be careful, she said. If it is Blackwell, he was always more of a snake than a man. Belle looked right at her. Then we will be sure to walk carefully. Belle Knox accepted the warning with a small nod. We will move with great care, she said. If everything goes right, we will return before the sun sets. Elizabeth Moore lowered her voice, looking over at Rowan Knox, who was carefully checking the supplies in her medical bag. Are you positive about bringing her with you? If Blackwell, or whoever is paying him, finds out you have a daughter? I am positive, Belle answered, her voice firm and clear. She needs to know what this work is really about. Not just the badge or the power, but the heavy responsibility that comes along with it. Her gaze followed Rowan's steady hands, and she added, and to be honest, she is ready. She is more ready than I ever was at her age. The way station at Sidewinder Pass was a strong adobe building set right up against red sandstone cliffs. It was built to give shelter to weary travelers and provide fresh teams for the long stretches between settlements. As the posse rode up, Belle took in the whole sorry scene at a glance. The stagecoach was tipped over, its horses standing nearby, unharmed but nervous. The driver's body lay under a blanket, treated with respect. The station master, a man named Abel Crowhurst, looked like he was carved from old wood, with a lifetime of sun baked into his face. He met them at his door holding a shotgun, but lowered it the second he saw Belle's badge. Thank the good Lord you are here, Marshal, he said, the relief in his voice cutting right through his tough-as-nails look. There are 5 passengers inside. 2 of them were hit. One lady was shot in the shoulder, and a gentleman was grazed on his head. They will make it, but they need some tending to. Belle swung down from her horse and gave Rowan a nod. My daughter has been trained in field medicine. She will look after the wounded while we pick up the trail. Inside the station, the passengers were huddled around a small stove. There was a well-dressed man and woman from San Francisco, a fellow who sold goods, and two sisters headed for Tucson. The hurt woman was lying on a cot somebody had put together, and her husband was pacing back and forth, worried sick. Rowan walked in with a quiet sureness, told them her name, and went right to work on the wounds. Belle watched for a moment, feeling a quiet pride as Rowan cleaned and bandaged the injuries, calming the folks down. Her steady hands and calm voice worked better than any bottle of medicine. "What happened out there?" Belle asked Crowhurst, who was standing close by. "Four men," he said, his voice low and serious. Their faces were covered up. They jumped the stage about a mile to the east. They shot poor Jenkins right off the driver's seat before he could even grab his shotgun. The one who seemed to be the leader did not say a single word. He just handed over a note demanding their valuables and left that card behind. "The ace of spades," Belle said softly. "Did they take anything besides money and jewelry?" Crowhurst paused for a second. The husband of the wounded lady was carrying some papers. They were deeds to land, property located near where they planned to build the new railroad station in Rattlesnake Gulch. All the pieces fell into place right then in Belle's head. Hollis Granger's ghost was still causing trouble. His friends were still at it, using the old stories of the Blackwell Raiders to cover their tracks, while they went after land along the new train line. She pulled Rowan to the side and spoke quietly. "This might not be the Blackwell gang at all. This smells a lot more like Granger's people that using old tricks to throw us off. You need to stay watchful while I am gone. If I am right about this, then this whole robbery was just a show to get me out of town and away from you." Rowan nodded, not hesitating for a moment. "I will keep my Remington right by my side." Belle gave her shoulder a firm squeeze, then walked back outside to join the posse. As they rode out, Cyrus Holt moved his horse up next to hers. "Are you thinking what I am thinking? This has Granger's name written all over it," Belle answered, "ace of spades or not." Cyrus made a sour face. "I left 4 deputies back in town, all armed and ready." The trail led them through some rough country with just a dusting of snow on the ground. Sometimes the tracks were plain as day, and other times they just about disappeared into the rocks and brush. But Belle could read the signs like a book. All those years riding guard for Wells Fargo taught her to see things other folks would miss. By the middle of the afternoon, the tracks went straight into a tight box canyon with tall, straight walls on 3 sides. Belle held up her hand, stopping the posse. "Something about this is not right," she said in a low voice. "No outlaw worth his salt would ever trap himself like this." She got down from her horse, looked at the ground carefully, and then stood up straight, completely sure of herself. "These tracks were put here for us to find. They are too clean, too neat." "You think it is an ambush?" Cyrus asked, his eyes scanning the tops of the canyon walls. "I am almost certain of it," Belle said, "and while we are stuck down here, the real trouble is happening back in town." Cyrus understood immediately. "I am riding back to Rattlesnake Gulch," Belle told the rest of the posse. "You men stay put. Do not go into that canyon. If anybody shows themselves, follow them, but do not start a fight unless you have backup." She and Cyrus rode hard, pushing their horses with a sense of urgency. "They are just using the Blackwell name like a smokescreen," Belle said. "This is about getting revenge for Granger and getting control of that railroad land." Cyrus nodded, his face grim. "It is smart, and it is ruthless." "There is more to it," Belle added. "Granger kept a file on everybody, and that includes me." "And Rowan," Cyrus said, realizing the full danger. Belle urged her horse to go even faster, the fear for her daughter's safety now bigger than any other thought in her mind. When they got back to the way station, everything was calm. Rowan had gotten both of the injured passengers stable and had things organized for them to be moved as soon as a new coach could get there. "Was there any trouble?" Belle asked, jumping down from her horse. Rowan shook her head. "It has been all quiet, but Crowhurst thought he saw something." About an hour before they got back, Abel Crowhurst had seen a lone rider sitting on his horse up on the ridge, just watching the station. By the time he went to get a better look, the rider was gone, vanished back into the rocks. Belle Knox looked over at Cyrus Holt. "They are keeping an eye on us," she said in a low voice, "which means their little distraction worked just like they planned." The replacement stagecoach showed up not long after that. It had 2 armed guards riding with it, a smart move that Cyrus had arranged before he left town. As the wounded folks were being helped onto the coach, Belle made a quick, firm decision. "Rowan, you are going with them," and she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "As soon as you get to town, get anything important from the ranch and go straight to Elizabeth Moore's house. You stay there until I come for you." For the first time, Rowan Knox did not put up a fight. She could hear in her mother's voice that this was not up for discussion. "You be careful, Ma," she said, giving Belle a tight hug before she climbed into the stagecoach. After the coach was safely on its way, Belle and Cyrus turned their horses back toward Rattlesnake Gulch. They took the hard way over Diamondback Ridge. It was a rough and narrow shortcut, but it would get them there ahead of anyone trying to cause trouble in town or stop the stage. As they came over the last hill that looked down into the valley, Belle pulled her horse to a sudden stop. Cyrus followed her gaze. Small trails of smoke were twisting up into the sky from the direction of her ranch. "They are trying to burn you out of your home," Cyrus said, his voice soft. Belle's jaw was set like stone, and her hand was resting on the Colt revolver at her hip. "They are trying," she answered, "but they have made a big mistake about who they are messing with." "A widow trying to protect her land?" Cyrus suggested. Belle shook her head. The change in her was clear as day. The way she sat in the saddle, the cold, sharp look in her eyes. The woman she had tried to leave behind was now out in the open for all to see. "No," she said, her voice as steady as the flat Texas plains. "A woman who is done running from her own legend." They spurred their horses onward, riding hard toward the smoke. As they got closer, Belle, a sudden quiet calm washed over her. For 6 long years, she had tried to live as just a piece of the woman she was, thinking that was the only way to survive. But now, with her past out in the open and her feet planted firm in the here and now, she felt whole again for the first time since Ian Knox drew his last breath. Whoever was waiting for her at that burning ranch, whether it was a leftover Blackwell rider or one of Hollis Granger's hired guns, they were in for a surprise. They would not find the fragile widow they expected. They would not find the lone gunslinger of the old days either. No, they were about to face something far more dangerous. They would face a woman who had finally made peace with every part of herself, a law woman with her town standing right behind her, and a mother who had finally given her daughter the truth instead of just a roof over her head. The name Quick Draw Catherine had not disappeared when Belle Knox settled down in Rattlesnake Gulch. It had just been put away, waiting for the right time, when the past and the present would come together to build a future strong enough to hold them both. And that time had finally come. From the bottom of our hearts, we want to thank you. Your support means more to us than you know. If this story stirred something deep inside of you, we sure hope you will stay a part of this journey into the past. We have more true stories of honor, kindness, and destiny waiting for you right here. Please subscribe, share the story, and leave a comment. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Now for a little legal notice. Our stories are made for artistic and entertainment reasons. They might take a few liberties with history and add some fictional details. We carefully use modern tools to help with the work, but a real person always has the final say on the editing, the feeling of the story, and making sure it all makes sense. We follow all the rules for using these kinds of tools in media and do not make fake videos or try to trick anyone. All the music and pictures we use are properly sourced. We ask that you get our permission before you share or use any part of this story. Your respect is what allows us to keep on telling stories that matter.